We will be heading back to our Leadership 101 coursework, and we're specifically this morning talking about Jesus' leadership. And before I begin, I want to remind everyone that Leadership 101 is about leadership in the church, or the church's leadership. So this applies to men, women, young, old. There's no one who's excluded from this form of leadership. We'll talk about later this summer, we'll do 102, which will be talking about men in leadership, and then 103, talking about men as elders. So there'll be some distinction there. But this morning, as we're continuing on our 101, this is for everyone. So this is not just for a particular type of person. This is for God's body. Leadership is influence. Pastor Adam has been saying that too, and I'll remind us all of that. So we all have influence. So you can be an influence for good, you can be an influence for evil. It's not necessarily a specific type of influence, but any type of influence is actually a form of leadership. So your smile, your frown, your comment, a moment of silence are all forms of influence. And as a result, they're forms of leadership. Your facial expressions or attitude, your life example, all impact the room and the world around you. And as a result, again, are forms of leadership. Are there better forms of leadership, more full expressions of leadership? Certainly. I don't mean to say that your moment of silence is the exact and strongest version of leadership or influence there can be, but it is still influence and needs to be considered under this banner of leadership. So if you came in today, as we're getting ready to talk about leadership more, namely Christ's example in leadership, if you're thinking, oh, I am too timid, I am too shy, I'm too quiet, I am not a leader, it's not my calling. I would just lovingly tell you that that line of thinking is unbiblical and ultimately disobedient to God's word. Christ models godly leadership for us as our example, and refusing to imitate, that's a key word, refusing to imitate his pattern disobeys our call to walk in true discipleship. One thing before we begin, though, I wanted to highlight is the word servant leadership. I guess that's two words depending on how you treat your hyphens. Servant leadership is not a bad term. I've used it. If you're in a job interview, people might ask you, what's your leadership style? And an easy one to reach for as a believer, as a Christian, is servant leadership. So I'm not here to hate on that phrase or that expression. I will continue to use it. You feel free to do the same. But one of the problems with servant leadership, at least when we think of it as a term, is that when you hyphenate two separate ideas and bring them together, is that you don't plumb the depths of either one of those concepts. So we weaken the idea of what it means to be a servant, and we subdue the idea of what it means to be a leader. So it's sort of like saying the loving holiness of God. Are we right to... Is God holy? Of course. Is he loving? Of course he is. Are we wrong to join those concepts together? No, we're not. But when you say that, you always run the risk of trying to put too big of a concept in too small of a box. So again, this is not an anti-servant leadership. Let's burn the term and give everyone a black eye who says that. I will continue to say it. I might even say it today. So that's not my point. My point is to get our minds around how we might be constraining the fullness of what Christ demonstrates for us in his leadership. If you would, turn to Matthew chapter 20. That's where we're going to start today, is in Matthew chapter 20. We're going to be looking at Christ and his example of leadership. And before we do that, we'll begin with a word of prayer. Father, I pray that you would open your word to us today. Pray that you would use me as a flawed instrument to highlight what you've been showing me. and that it would be powerful, not because of the speaker, but because your word is powerful and your word is good. Help us to see and behold Christ today and learn from his example and imitate him and produce kingdom-glorifying results by our followership of him. It's in your name we pray. Amen. If you are the note-taking type, we're going to be looking at 4 different themes today, or 4 different ideas. So one is the teaching of Jesus. The second is the example of Jesus, the imitation of Jesus, and then a key description of Jesus' leadership. And I'll try to highlight that, so if you're the note-taking type, you can follow along as well. But first, let's look at the teaching of Jesus, Matthew chapter 20 and verse 20. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee, James and John, came up to him, that's Jesus, with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Say that these 2 sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom." Jesus answered, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" They said to him, "We are able." He said to them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." And when the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the 2 brothers. But Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So let's make a few observations from this passage. The first thing we're going to look at here is the world's vision of leadership. So if you look at verse 21, as we're looking at the world's vision of leadership, we see position and visibility. She said to him, "Say that these 2 sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom." We understand the idea of the right-hand man, or simply in royal prominence, the idea of sitting on either side of a ruler. We get that instinctively. We see that even in modern monarchy today. And she is asking for visibility, for positional prominence in Christ's kingdom. This world sees leadership first and foremost as positional, as visibility-oriented. Be up front, be noticed, be seen, be big, be first. So position and visibility. Next, notice also in verse 21, seated and served. James and John's mother requested that her sons be seated rulers. She wants them to be sitting. Why is that? Well, and this is still true again today of kings, is that if you are seated, you are the depiction of active, ruling, sovereign power. The seated king is the ruling king. And in the presence of the king, you either stand or you bow. If you are seated, it's actually an idea of prominence. It calls to mind Esther chapters 4 and 5, where King Ahasuerus is seated on his throne, and Queen Esther is afraid to enter his throne room. At the end of chapter 4, it says, "Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Don't bother the seated king. That's the short version here. It's the full display of authority. It's deadly. But I also want to say that the seated king is also deadly to the world's, or to Christ's vision of service. The point is this: the seated ruler is the served ruler. The seated ruler isn't washing anyone's feet. The seated ruler isn't offering a cup of cold water. They're seated. No, they are receiving. They are not giving. Next, notice lordship and authority from the world's vision of leadership there. Look at verse 25. But Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them." Note that this word over appears twice here. Lord it over, exercise authority over. In English, that word over is a separate word, separate from the other words that are following it. But in Greek, it's a primary participle, and languages have never been my gift, so laboring through this is hard for me, so bear with me. But it's a primary participle. And why does that matter? Well, it's attached to the root word. In the Greek, it's even more vivid than in the English. That the word over is not wrong, but there's more to it than that. It actually means over and down. It actually has this idea of downward. So what we're looking at here is that it's not just lording over, it's not just ruling over, it's the idea of lording over the people to move them down into a position of domination, of being dominated, to be ruled over and down. We must grasp this idea of over-the-top ruling downward that Jesus describes here. And if we miss this, we miss the significance of everything that will follow in Jesus' teaching about leadership. So there we have the world's vision of leadership. Let's look at the Savior's vision of leadership. Again, back in 26 now. "It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." First thing I want to point out about the Savior's vision of leadership is that it's radically differentiated. If you look at the beginning of verse 26 there, "It shall not be so among you." Jesus tells the story of the world's vision of leadership and then creates a stark contrast and says, "It shall not be so among you." This is a command. He's telling us to put off an old way of thinking and adopt God's pattern for leadership. Jesus commands us to think and act differently. He highlights that there is a way that the world leads, and then there's a way that Christ's disciples must lead. And these two are not only in contrast to each other, they are diametrically opposed to one another. They are at war with each other. So it's not enough to just do better than the world, to be a kinder, gentler leader, or even to run from leadership entirely. Like, oh, that's messed up. I'm just going to not do that at all. No, Christ commands us to do something entirely and radically different from the world's version and vision of leadership. Next, notice that the least is the greatest. So if you look at verse 26 there, the second half, "But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave." And if you're wondering what those words servant and slave mean, they mean exactly those words. That is exactly what they mean. So this is a weighty thought. At Northland Baptist Bible College, where I was a student, or Northland International University as it later became called, graduates, in addition to their diploma when they came across the stage, would also receive a small white hand towel that was embroidered with the words, "Be great, serve." I think that towel, rather than a scepter or a crown, that imagery illustrates the heart of this matter. Be great, serve. Here's your towel. And we'll talk about that passage more fully here in a little bit. But next thing to notice, least is greatest, desire greatness that looks like Jesus' ministry. If you look at 26b there, kind of second half of 26, see that would be in 26 and then in 27. Another way to translate that is whoever desires or whoever wishes. Note that Jesus doesn't condemn the desire for greatness. If you look back in verse 25, see that phrase, great ones there? A few verses later, Jesus is contrasting the worldly vision of greatness with the godly version, the Christ-exalting version. This English word for greatness in Greek is literally megas, which we get our word for mega. Not really hard to see that one. So do you want to be great? You want to be a great leader? You want to be a mega leader? Become so huge of a servant that you're the least noticeable. Become first place in being last. That's what Jesus is saying. And that's entirely backward to this world. We want to be mega. We want to be great for our name, for our position, for our status, for our identity. We want position. We want visibility. We want to be seated and served. We want lordship and authority. But Christ's kingdom isn't like ours. Christ's leadership isn't like the world's. But I want to point out that Christ's leadership isn't passive either. This isn't false humility or self-deprecation. The church doesn't need a bunch of toe-twirling, I'm no good, I can't do anything to serve anybody, I'm just a nobody. No. Sweat, toil, use your gifts, be bold, show up looking to serve, to pour out massive, humble, Christ-exalting grace into other people's lives. This is not false humility. Leaders lead, servants serve. What good leader stands on the sidelines and says, I don't have what it takes. I can't meet that need. Maybe someone's better at it than I am. I'm not as skilled as so-and-so. What if someone notices me and thinks I'm doing this? They think I'm proud. What if they think I'm trying to steal the spotlight? What if they think I'm trying to steal the show? Namely, we need to stop caring about our glory. We need to stop trying to avoid or gain the spotlight. Both of those stem from the same heart, which is myself, my identity, my perception, how I look. Some of you might say, Paul, I can't do what you're doing right now. I couldn't stand up there and talk to people. That's not the point. The point isn't what I'm doing. I'm not the example. You're not called to do what I'm doing necessarily. You're called to do the task that is set before you. That's what servants do. They don't get to choose their task. They do the work that's in front of them. Next, notice life-giving ransom. In verse 28, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. How do you know if you're leading like Christ? Namely, your service produces results. But what type of results? In verse 28, it says Christ didn't come to be served. What did he come here to do? To serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. You are called to give your life in a way that brings life to others. Your service is to be an image of Christ's leadership. It should be life-giving. It should be ransom-paying. It should be debt-relieving. So questions. Do people walk away from the interactions with you having been given fresh, Christ-exalting vitality? Are they energized in their walk with Christ? Do people run to you as a well from which they can drink sweet waters? Or do they avoid the sourness and dryness of your soul? Hear me, weary coworker, tired mom. You are called to be a bringer of life. We need to stop idolizing these famous executives and CEOs. Most of them exemplify a version of leadership that will ultimately burn in hell. You want to know about leadership? Nurture these little souls around you, mom. Show them the way. Show them Christ. Hey, tired mother, you may be this church's most effective, most deliberate, eternity-impacting leader. The gates of hell are raging to stop your leadership of your children at home. Tired mom, you may be last in this world, but oh, you will be great in God's kingdom. Teach those children what it is to follow Christ. May you become bold in sharing the hope of God's word with them. May your view sharing on social media, and do it. It's not about social media, but may your view sharing on social media pale in comparison to your active, intentional sharing of Christ, exalting truth into their day-to-day life. Shame on any of us if our message is more bold on social media, more kind on social media, more active, more deliberate than it is with the person that we sit across from in the pew, the person that lives with us in our home. That's what Jesus did. Become a well of sweet water from which other people can drink. Don't show up to serve, don't show up to be served, but to serve. Are you a consumer or a giver? I was thinking about this just this week. I read a book on discipleship, and there was a series of questions, and one of the questions that he asked is, did you pull into the parking lot today at church and think, where can I park to serve others? Where can I sit that would serve others? What can I talk about that would serve others? Who should I talk to that I can serve them? Did you think this week about Grace Bible Church and what it doesn't offer? The right programs, the right opportunities, the right people? How much time did we give to considering how we might be that leader, that servant that would bring to pass what our souls actually crave in this body? Lead, serve. That's what Jesus did. He didn't come to be a consumer, but a giver, to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Let's look at the example of Jesus. So we just covered the teaching of Jesus on leadership. Now let's look at the example of Jesus. We're going to look at the kind of a vignette or a snapshot of Jesus' leadership in real time, kind of the tactics. He's actually doing what we're talking about. And then we're also going to look at the big picture, the panorama of the strategy, if you will. It's the battle map of where everything from start to finish and how this all works. So turn with me to John chapter 13. John chapter 13. And we'll start there in verse 1. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. That is why he said, "Not all of you are clean." When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." There's a lot in this passage, but we're just going to highlight a couple key things. First thing to highlight there is that Christ's position, his leadership position, motivated him to greater service, not lesser service. Look at verses 3 and 4. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given him all things into his hands, that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. Jesus knows that he's in charge of everything. Everything is within his authority and control. He knows that he came from God. He knows that he's going back to God. And what does he do with that knowledge? What does he do with that authority? This is the absolute perfect moment for Christ to demand to be served, to be waited on, or at least to be disengaged or passive. Maybe just let someone else do the work, right? No, Christ does the exact opposite. His knowledge of authority, power, and union with God motivated him toward service. Thinking through this passage, something just jumped out at me, which is, picture this, that Jesus, the creator of all things, the authority over all things, washes the dust of the earth from the feet of the men he formed from that same dust. That's a vivid image of Christ's condescension. Can we even fathom that level of servitude from God, the creator God, washing stinky, dirty feet? I know that Peter gets a lot of heat. But can we join Peter for just a moment and be absolutely gobsmacked at the implications of what this kind of servitude from God means? Do we see what Peter's saying here? I think we need to join Peter in being like, what is happening? You're God. Don't do this. Don't wash my feet. This is backwards. And it is. Jesus' vision of leadership is backwards from this world. Also notice that Christ embraces his role as leader and teacher. There in verse 13 it says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am." Some people, maybe because they're unwilling to accept the magnitude of this scene and what's unfolding, They make Jesus into a marvelous do-gooder in this scene of washing feet, a cosmic Pollyanna of sorts. Oh, look at how kind Jesus is. Jesus is kind. Jesus is good. But he's more than that. He's the very means. He's the very source of good. Jesus says, we are correct, we are right to see him as leader, as Lord, as teacher. He is highlighting for us, yes, hello, see this. I'm not laying aside my lordship. I'm not laying aside my teacher status. I'm telling you this is a new paradigm for what leadership actually looks like. Flip it. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Christ's lordship amplifies his service. As we noticed previously, Christ intentionally reminds us of his status as supreme ruler, Lord of all. He reminds us that he's the teacher. But then look at verse 14. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done for you. Truly, truly, I say to you that a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. He's given us an example. He set the pattern for true followers for what it means to be a teacher and a leader. The servant is not greater than the master. So if the master does the lowest of tasks, we must also engage in selfless, radical service that follows his example. Just in a practical example, that if servants see their masters doing a task, if servants see their leaders or superiors doing a task, they rush in and they take over the lowly duties. They're like, no, this is not how this works. Like, no, you go do your other thing. We do this. But Jesus says, no, don't interrupt what I'm doing. I'm setting an example. Now go and imitate me in doing the same. Do you catch that in that passage? Peter tries to stop him. Like, no, like, we'll figure this out, Jesus. Like, we'll go grab someone from, downstairs or whatever to come up here and do this, or one of us will do this. This is wrong for you. You should not be doing this. You're Lord and teacher. But Jesus says, no, don't interrupt this. Imitate this. Are you the least of the saints in this room? Good. Catch a vision of the leadership God's calling you towards. Grab your towel, literally or figuratively, and start mopping up messes on the floor. And even more so, stop mopping up messes in people's hearts. Christ promises blessing to those who know and do these things. Look at verse 17 there. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. There's no reward for knowledge. Biblical intellectualism gets you nowhere. Now, I'm not condemning knowledge, neither is Jesus. You do need to know these things. But blessed are you if you do them. And this isn't a superficial happiness or a fleeting health and wealth blessing. This is a blessing of spiritual well-being. Maybe another way to express that is it's experiencing God's delight in us and through us. Jesus uses this same expression of blessing in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. Blessed, or if you prefer modern English, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Verse 7 says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. That's a rich blessing that's far more valuable than material blessing or goods. Okay, so we're looking in that vignette, that little moment in time where we got to see Jesus practice that form of leadership. We got to see him demonstrate for us what it actually looks like in real time. Now we're going to look at the big picture, the panorama, the strategy map of Jesus' leadership. So turn with me to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, and we'll listen in on the Apostle Paul as he explains this to the church at Philippi. So if there's any encouragement in Christ, verse 1, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each one of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Here's this strategy. Here's the long-term strategy map. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. This passage tells us that Jesus' leadership model works. But we're graspers, aren't we? We're not like Jesus in that way. We can easily count everything as something to be grasped, something to be attained. We're always grasping at the next promotion, the next house, the next paycheck, the next car, the next stage of our relationship, the next. Always grasping. And sure, some of this straining is actually image bearing. We're reflecting God's pattern of ruling and subduing, that we're building, that we're growing, that we're improving. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. But I think we can all confess that sin easily creeps in to even that image-bearing process. 1 minute, what started as a remodel of your basement or whatever ends up becoming a reflection of our image, our status, our achievement. 1 minute, what started as righteously training our children has become a reflection of our wisdom, our maturity, and our identity. What started as a desire for promotion to better provide has become our security, our confidence. What started as a relationship of lovingly pointing each other to Christ has become a source of self-fulfillment, self-worship, and idolatrous fixation. Do you see how it can go bad? Something so good of ruling and subduing, doing what we're called to do, from the perversion of sin, can flip it around the wrong way, and it becomes something about us and our kingdom and our identity and what we look like and how we are perceived. But not so with Christ. Christ had everything. Look at verse 5. Having this mind in yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Christ didn't consider his equality with God a thing to be seized, grasped, or held on to. He had it. It was his. But he humbled himself by becoming obedient to earthly powers, earthly rulers, earthly death on an earthly cross. He hung on a tree he made from the ground he formed by men he breathed into existence. Now that is magnificence. The Apostle Paul says as much. Verse 9, therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. And every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. This leadership plan works. And it's the plan for every disciple, every follower of Christ. There's no personality type. There's no gender. There's two, by the way. There's no age range or season of life that gets you an exemption pass from leadership. This is following Christ. This is what it looks like. If you're in Christ, if you've been ransomed by him, you are called to imitate this sort of leadership. Let's look at third, the imitation of Jesus and the resulting influence of our example. So John 3:15, we already covered this, but it says, for I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. We should model this as he modeled it. I've given you an example. Look at Philippians 3:17. Brothers, join in imitating me and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. Here we see the Apostle Paul rallying the Philippian believers, the Philippian church, and saying, the example you have in me, the example you have in this missionary team, follow us. Be imitators of us as we follow Christ. You might be reading that and think, well, the Apostle Paul was probably pretty near perfect, nothing like me. So he could tell other people to follow him without leading someone astray. One, let's get this straight here. The Apostle Paul wasn't perfect. He says as much in his own epistles. And two, you are called to imitate the Apostle Paul as he imitates Christ. That call applies to each one of you. This is the heartbeat of discipleship. And if you're hearing me talk about this and you're starting to think, Paul, this sounds a lot more like discipleship or followership of Jesus than it does leadership. That's the cool thing. You're right. You figured it out. God's version of leadership is discipleship. It's helping other people follow God. It's helping other people follow in his footsteps. Sometimes we can overcomplicate discipleship and make it into a program. It's something for new believers. It's something that when you join a church, you take like a 3-week class on discipleship. I'm not saying those things are unhelpful or useless or that we should mock them or not do them. Discipleship is following Jesus. It's a forever deal. And that's just how it works. That's the commitment. That's what you're signed up for. And that's what Jesus is calling us toward. First Timothy 4:12 says, let no one despise you for your youth. This is Apostle Paul talking to Timothy. But set the believers an example in speech and conduct, in love, in faith, and purity. The Apostle Paul reminds young Timothy not to let anyone resent his age. Why? The Apostle Paul is encouraging Timothy to continue the pattern. Timothy was influenced by Paul as Paul imitated Christ. Paul was Timothy's example. So here we have the Apostle Paul reminding Timothy of the pattern. Hey, Timothy, remember, this is the pattern. This is how this works. Set an example, Timothy. Use your God-appointed leadership and influence to model a pattern of speech, of conduct, of love, of faith, and purity. This is a weighty charge for Timothy. But we should see that it's also a weighty charge for us. We're called to do the same. Christ said to imitate his example, and we see this repeated throughout the New Testament, where influence brings imitation, and imitation sets an example for yet another generation of followers. That's what we're called to do. Last, let's look at a key description of Jesus' leadership. Number 4, a key description of Jesus' leadership. And one I want to highlight that I say a key instead of the key, because I think it's safe to say that there are many things that we could highlight as being core to Jesus' leadership. So I don't want to put this in this place of this is the only thing you should know about Jesus' leadership. But I think it's incredibly vital that we do know this about Jesus' leadership. So here it is. What's the key? What's a key? Meekness. But here's the problem. When most of us hear meek or meekness, we think meek as a mouse. We think passive or shy or maybe even cowering. Let me read you Merriam-Webster's definition of meekness. Enduring injury with patience and without resentment. Let me read that again. That's not a biblical definition, but it's pretty good. Enduring injury with patience and without resentment. Now we're getting closer to the biblical idea. Let's kind of set the meek as a mouse, the timid, the cowering version aside. There's endurance. There's patience and no resentment. This isn't passivity. This is active, controlled strength. Biblical meekness is even better. So first I want to point out, we don't have time to go there, but meekness is a descriptor of Christ, the healthy church, King David, Moses, the Apostle Paul, and other key biblical figures and contexts throughout Scripture. So we can't just say, I don't believe in no meek Jesus. I don't know if you've ever heard that sort of line or that sort of thinking before, but it is unbiblical. 1 Corinthians 10:1 says, I, Paul, myself entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. We have to do something with that description of Christ. We have to wrestle with it and acknowledge that our definition may not match God's. Or perhaps even more daunting is that perhaps we formed a version of Jesus after our image, after our own strengths, instead of after the image of God himself. Pastor Adam describes meekness in this way. Meekness is strength under control. That's catchy. Meekness is strength under control. That's an easy one to call back. But for the sake of our study, I started thinking meekness is strength under control of what? Like what is controlling that strength? It's under control, but what is actually providing the control? So in typical Paul fashion, I made something that's far less memorable and callable, but I think it is helpful for our study. So I'll say it nonetheless. Here it is. Meekness is strength governed by humble confidence in the sovereignty, power, and goodness of God. Meekness is strength governed by humble confidence in the sovereignty, power, and goodness of God. We see that in Jesus' example. He knew who he was. He knew who was in control. He knew what his role was, and he had strength under control. He was not passive. He was not timid. He was not weak in the true sense. but it was under control. Under control of what? It was under the control of the mission and vision of his heavenly Father. Jesus is always working. He is always about his Father's business. This isn't timidity. This isn't shyness. This isn't cowering. This is strength that is submitted, governed by humble confidence in the sovereignty, power, and goodness of God. So what does that mean for our leadership? What does that mean for our servitude? One, it means many things. But it means you don't need to rush to your own defense. You don't need to squash those who insult or undermine your leadership. You don't need to get bigger, badder, louder when someone disagrees with you. You don't need to manipulate circumstances to your favor. If you want to do more study on this idea of meekness, which I think is excellent, read 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and 5 this week for a great display of what meekness looks like in real time for the believer. Read the story of Christ's crucifixion and the various gospel accounts to understand what meekness looks like. This isn't holy passivity. Push, strive, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. It's God working in you to both to will and to work and to do for his good pleasure. Don't be a fatalist. Don't be lazy. Jesus wasn't a fatalist. He was constantly about his Father's business. When evil men hit him, the Creator God, he could have destroyed the universe with a thought, with a very flicker of his will in his mind. He could have destroyed it all. He bound the atoms that were their very existence together by his will, by his providence. But he didn't. Why not? Because his strength was bound to the eternal plan of the Father. And that is meekness. His desires, though his body was being destroyed, though his poor sweat drops of blood, did not grasp for equality to God, to take it up and to wield his strength against mankind. No, he used his strength, and he set an example for us by redeeming us. His absolute faith was in God's plan, and we are to follow that same example in our service, in our leadership. That was his hope. He was controlled by the knowledge of who his heavenly Father is and what he must do to obey and glorify him. Wrapping up here. If you aim to lead, and you must lead, because we're all called to be leaders who imitate Christ. So if you say, I don't want to lead, and I do understand that there are realms of leadership, there are realms and capacities of leadership to which you might not be called. I get that. But this version of leadership is called imitation. It's called discipleship. If you aim to lead, and we must imitate Christ and his example. We must adopt biblical meekness. Let's imitate Christ's example. Let's check our strength under the humbling confidence in God's sovereignty, power, and goodness. Do you want to lead? Do you want to have influence? You should. We all must imitate our leader, our Lord, Jesus Christ. So let's press on to be meek leaders who serve. Not grasping, not this top-down, me over you, push you down worldly model, but Christ's hands and knees, towel and basin, cradle to cross version that he set before us as an example. Do you want to be mega? You want to be huge? Jesus says, the great ones serve. Do you have great strength and ability? Do you have talent? Good. Good. Govern it with the humility of God's sovereignty, power, and goodness. Let's pray. Father, thank you for sending your Son, not only as an example to imitate, but as first fruits of resurrection and new life. Thank you for sending him to pay our debt, to ransom us, to make us clean, to not only wash feet, but to wash all of us. Thank you for Jesus. I pray that you would encourage our hearts, that even as we think of the, in many ways, utterly simplistic version of leadership that Christ sets before us, it is also wildly daunting. You give grace for all that you command. I pray that you would help us to walk in that same grace, honor you in it, and bring much glory to your Son, Jesus. It's in your name we pray. Amen.